We have Republican candidate for president, Vivek Ramaswamy, joining us now. Welcome to the program.
Good to see you guys.
Well, let's get right into it. We've obviously been covering the Israel-Palestine conflict quite a bit on the show. You said that U.S. aid to Israel should be contingent on their plan for Gaza. You know, there is disagreement on the right now about what should be the U.S.'s foreign policy more broadly. We talked earlier in the show about Ben Shapiro clashing with Tucker Carlson, Tucker being more of a voice for restraint, Ben Shapiro, wanting to give Israel whatever it needs and then some. Where do you fit in on this question? What do you think the U.S. policy should be? What would it be if you were president?
Sure. So I think that there are two reasonable paths here. I have a preference between those paths, but they're at least coherent. One is actually embracing the true Israel first and true America first view. That's what I favor. And the founding of Israel was based on the idea that Israel has an absolute right to national self-existence and to defend itself as it appropriately should. And I stand for that view, Israel's Israel first view. I'm an America first leader of the United States that says every decision I make as the U.S. president is made with a moral obligation to the American people. So what does that mean in terms of policy? I think we should provide Israel a diplomatic iron dome that stops any other country or the UN or anybody else criticizing or getting in the way of Israel substantively defending its own homeland. That attack by Hamas on Israel, it was inhumane, it was subhuman, it was barbaric. And Israel absolutely has the right to defend itself. And our job can be a diplomatic one to give Israel the air cover that it needs diplomatically to be able to do that. I think that's the cleanest solution for all. I think that we have been wrongfully engaged with military presence in the Middle East for decades that has not served us well. However, I'm not president yet, if we're going down the path of talking about complex forms of aid, financially or militarily or otherwise, then yes, the U.S., and my job as the U.S. president will have to be to then ask demanding questions about what exactly is the plan for a ground invasion of Gaza. Is it a prolonged conflict? Is it one that results in a likely two-front war that further draws the U.S. in? We have to have clear answers to those questions so that we can clearly state this is what we will and what we won't support. Right now, I'm worried we live in the worst of both worlds, though, which is neither of those two reasonable options, but a third reasonable option that vaguely has some ill-defined financial and military commitments when we don't even understand what exactly those objectives are. So do I think Israel has to answer to the United States? No. Israel doesn't need the U.S. permission to do what it needs to advance its own interests. But if there's going to be a serious discussion about U.S. involvement, then yes, it's the job of the U.S. to ask those questions. I think that's a coherent position. It's my view. It's one that probably other Republicans, some of them behind closed doors, would share if they weren't so scared of their own shadows in being labeled anti-Israel if they say this. The irony is that this isn't anti-Israel. This is deeply pro-Israel, aligned with the original founding vision of Israel itself, that it has the right to defend itself. And that's what I stand for. I'm an America First leader, and I endorse Israel pursuing an Israel First agenda as well.
So help me understand your distinction between yourself and other candidates. It does seem to me that constructively what you're saying is that the U.S. would continue to fund the Iron Dome. It provides around $3.8 billion of military aid to Israel, including for that purpose every year. And so it does sound like you're in line with the Republican and Democratic establishment in continuing funding, military funding for Israel. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was using an expression of the diplomatic Iron Dome.
So what does that mean to you?
It was a turn of phrase. So fair enough. If it was unclear, let me explain it. What I mean by that is, there's been a long habit of the UN and other institutions pressuring Israel to take steps that would not allow it to fully defend itself, creating a false equivalence between Israel's national self-defense and the actions of Hamas or the other terrorists who target Israel. So my view is we should diplomatically, as a matter of diplomacy, stand publicly at the UN or otherwise in favor of Israel's ability to come to its own national self-defense.
Okay, I think I understand.
Without any U.S. involvement. So, there's the physical Iron Dome. I use the phrase the diplomatic Iron Dome, providing that level of diplomatic air cover.
Right.
That's
so
our
my
job.
follow-ups would then be, would you then cut funding? Would you stop funding Israel to the tune of about $3 to $4 billion a year, the way we have been doing historically? And also on the point of what the perhaps limits of Israel's right to defend itself. The question on the international community and before the UN is whether or not Israel's acts are in fact in self-defense for two reasons. One is that at this point, there has been a disproportionate response when you look at the number of people killed in the horrific events of October 7th, which is around 1,400 Israelis, versus now verging on 6,000 people of Gaza, innocent women, children, civilians that have been killed in that attack. Is it the case that at some point Israel's actions against the people of Gaza is no longer rightly considered to be self-defense in a way that would then justify the UN's attempt at having a humanitarian pause that the U.S. did veto?
So I reject both the left-wing criticism as well as the neocon bloodthirst here. The left-wing criticism, though, is this idea of proportionality. I reject that because it almost pretends as though those things were happening at the same time. They weren't. Israel was struck, minding its own business, struck by a terrorist group, really, that killed 1,000+ innocent civilians. And so Israel absolutely has a right to fully send a deterrent signal to make sure that can never happen again.
Are there any limits on that?
My view is, what's that?
Are there any limits on that signal? For example, if they were
That's
to
for Israel
kill
to determine.
every, I'm sorry?
If
they were to kill every Gazan,
Israel
for
to
instance.
determine.
So with the U.S. backing and support, the international community and the U.S. should stand by, just hypothetically, if all 2.3 million Gazans were killed.
But this is where I come out. This is where I just want to come out to be consistent. This is exactly why I think the U.S. should not be engaged militarily.
So,
if the U.S. is engaged militarily.
Then, so the question then is, if Israel using U.S. tax dollars were to do something in violation of international law, like killing every Gazan, or let's use an example that's currently ongoing, since that obviously hasn't happened.
But Israel's not doing that. Right
no,
now.
That's why I said let's use an example that's actually happening, which is the collective punishment. That is cutting off gas, medical supplies, water, et cetera, to the entire population in violation of the Geneva Convention. Is that not the role of the U.S. or the international community to say that we don't want, at very least, American tax dollars going to continue that? And we should note that there's been an ongoing occupation of Gaza that preceded, of course, this conflict. And I'm curious to know whether you support U.S. tax dollars going on to, enabling what 18 international humanitarian organizations have described as an apartheid state.
So I think that a lot of those are unfair, inaccurate, and wrong descriptions of Israel. And I stand by that, and that's what I mean by when I talk about the diplomatic Iron Dome. As U.S. leader, as the leader of the United States, as the U.S. president, I will be crystal clear that Israel defending its own borders, that's exactly what I believe Israel is doing and has been doing, is absolutely defensible. Israel should pursue an Israel-first agenda. It has a right to national self-existence. But I think it is easier for me to do that as U.S. president if we don't muddy the waters by getting involved militarily or financially or otherwise. So we've made commitments in the past. I always stand by those commitments. Those run through 2028. But my point is, in the context of this war, look at the $16 billion aid in the $106 billion aid package that's now making its way through Congress. I don't think it's a good idea for the U.S. to further engage financially or militarily. But the flip side of that is that Israel is absolutely free to pursue what it believes to be in its own national self-interest, just as every other nation is free to do the same thing. My job as the United States president is to the people of this country. My exclusive obligation as the next president is to Americans here in the homeland. And that's how I'm going to lead this country accordingly, which is why I'm against the neocon call as well to willy-nilly provide aid. It muddies the waters. It creates loss of clarity that then commits us to have to make judgments that should not be the U.S.'s judgments to make. Those should be Israel's judgment on how it defends itself.
The Republican Party right now in Congress, in the House, they might be voting at this instant to potentially have a new speaker, the candidate now being Mike Johnson. There's been a lot of conversation for how the speaker and how the leader affects the aid packages to Ukraine and to Israel. Former President Donald Trump weighed in, rejecting the more establishment candidate Tom Emmer yesterday. What is your view of how this situation is unfolding in the House, and how do you feel about, what should the Republican congressional leadership, whoever it ends up being, do with respect to the funding of Israel and Ukraine?
So, look, I think that the Ukraine funding is a terrible idea. I do not think that we should be marching our way into further conflict. Ukraine has made no progress meaningfully relative to what they were supposed to make. And conversely, I even believe that we're driving Russia further into China's hands. So no matter how you measure it, this isn't advancing American interests. We're $33 trillion into national debt. We're marching our way into serious conflict when our own homeland is as vulnerable as it ever has been in modern history. We should find a reasonable path to peace in Ukraine. I've laid out a clear vision of how I would do that. I don't think that this should be conflated with border security funding or Israel funding or funding for the Asia Pacific to deter China. These should be debated separately. We already talked about Israel. I think that we should ideally stay out, allow Israel to defend itself, stand fully for that principle. If there's going to be any U.S. involvement of further aid at all, then we need to understand exactly what Israel's objectives are. The border security funding is going to the wrong place. It's going through actually more efficient processing of those asylum applications. What it needs to be going to is sealing the southern border instead. And as it relates to the GOP and the speaker race, look, the musical chairs we're seeing, it's a symptom of a deeper ideological divide in the GOP. Do you want to go the old direction of neoconservatism, or do we want to go the new direction of standing for unapologetic America First principles? I'm an America First conservative. That means that my moral obligation is to the citizens of this country, and that is different than the historical model of liberal hegemony or neoconservatism. But that's what's lurking beneath the surface. And so we're going to continue to play this game of silly musical chairs, arguing over the who, when we should be arguing over the what and the why. What do we stand for? Why do we stand for it? That's what I'm doing in this GOP primary, and I believe I'm leading us in the direction of the future. But we're going to have to commit to that, or else we're going to keep having these silly personnel disputes between who's the Speaker of the House or the leader of the RNC. These are second-order, less important questions than the what and the why.
And I also want to ask you about cancel culture and free speech. You disagreed with some other commentators. You expressed yourself on X, on Twitter the other day, saying that, you know, while you don't agree with what pro-Palestinian students or activists were saying, you thought it was harmful to say that they should be like blacklisted from jobs forever. One of your rivals for the GOP nomination, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, recently ordered Florida universities to shut down pro-Palestinian student groups, I think in a way that even could more obviously be violating the First Amendment or free speech than just blacklisting. Given that you'd spoken out, against this cancel culture and wanting to not be hypocritical on this, do you have thoughts on that action?
So I was not aware of that action until you shared it with me, but on the sound of it, on the face of it, if it's as you described it, that doesn't sound good to me. My view is that the answer to bad speech is not less speech, it is more speech. And I think it is wrong for us to silence those we disagree with. Now, my view is those Harvard students or those other student groups, they're way out of line. They're idiotic, they're foolhardy. They're on the wrong side of this question. And I reject the premise that somehow Israel is responsible for what happened to Israel. No, Hamas is responsible, and that's the answer. But the way we do this in the United States of America is through free speech and open debate. Are businesses free to decide who they hire or not? Sure, that's not a legal question in the case of businesses. But I don't think it's good for our culture when you have student groups that have made some stupid statements and boneheaded statements on a college campus. And by the way, part of college and part of youth is having the latitude to say some stupid things and learn from your stupidity. But then to ask the further question of what students were affiliated with those student groups and then turn them and put them onto blacklists, I don't think that's the American way. I don't think that's productive. And I don't think we convince any of those people by browbeating them into submission through fear either. That's the tactics that I've criticized of the radical left for the last several years. There's probably been no greater critic in America over the last 3 years of that type of left-wing cancel culture than me. I laid it out in my first book, Woke Inc. But I have to be consistent, and I don't believe in just using that in one political direction. I'm going to call that problem out wherever I see it, and I'm principled in believing that free speech and open debate, that is the path to truth. That is the American way, and I stick to my principles over politics. That's generally my view, and so whether that's a politically popular thing to say or not, I have no idea. But it is consistent with the principles that espouse the idea that in America, we settle our differences through free speech and open debate, not through the use of force, and I'll continue to stand by that now.
You mentioned that you think the students are on the wrong side of this issue. I wonder if you could elaborate on what your views are of the issue and what's driving the conflict in Israel and Palestine at this moment. I wonder if you could speak specifically to the ongoing occupation in Gaza. What, if anything, you see as the solution to those people who feel as though they've been pushed from their lands and kept in what has been described by a former Israeli prime minister as an open-air prison? What to do in the West Bank about the encroaching settlements that are also in violation of international law, and whether you agree with Joe Biden as he continues to push for a two-state solution.
So my view here is simply grounded in, again, principle. I'm an America First conservative. My moral obligation is to the citizens of this country. I think that that is perfectly legitimate for every other nation, including Israel, to pursue an Israel First policy.
But what about the people
Israel
of Palestine?
has a right to exist. What's that?
What about Palestinians? Do they also have a right to exist?
Well, they have a right to exist, but I think that they don't have a right to attack Israel in these dastardly attacks that have taken place serially, that have had to put Israel on the defensive.
Absolutely, but I would like you to weigh in on...
My view is, we're not having this discussion in the Middle East, we're having it here. My view is the U.S. needs to get the heck out of poking its nose into other people's business on the other side of the world. I mean, part of the reason that you even now have bases in places like Iraq or in Syria that are at risk of supposedly being attacked in this conflict is the problem that we shouldn't have been there in the first place. So my view is a broader disengagement in the Middle East is actually the right answer for the U.S. I'm not running for president of the world. I'm running for president of the United States of America. And I think we have to have discipline in addressing everything through what really relates to the interests of Americans here in the homeland. So that's the way I will lead this country, and I want to be disciplined about that.
With all due respect, Vivek, I do think that some people very much see our foreign policy as one of the key responsibilities of the President of the United States of America.
It is.
And included in that is our enormous veto power that we have in the United Nations, the incredible power that we have over foreign economies through direct diplomacy and also through tools like the IMF and the World Bank, et cetera. And so if your position is simply a truly isolationist one, that the U.S. will no longer have any involvement in global affairs, that is a somewhat radical position to take and something that's a little bit different from saying that I'm going to act internationally in America's best interest. Do you see the difference there? And so what I'm asking you is...
Well, it is, and I've never said that I want to disengage from global affairs. I think the real threat that we face is communist China. And every iota of military or economic attention that we're miring ourselves into conflicts in the Middle East with is one that leaves us weaker in deterring China from, say, annexing Taiwan, which right now, as we depend on Taiwan for semiconductors, absolutely affects the American way of life. I think the fact that China is pumping fentanyl across our southern border using the Mexican drug cartels as a vehicle to do it is killing Americans right here at home. A Chinese spy balloon flying over half this country. Yes, these are international issues that deeply matter to the United States. But my view is we have to look at global affairs through the prism of what affects Americans rather than to be the global international police. I've also been very open about questioning the wisdom of our continued involvement in the UN. I think the UN is a joke when you think about Venezuela or other countries like even North Korea staffing the Human Rights Council at the UN. This makes absolutely no sense, and if the UN or any other institution has outlived its purpose, the WHO, I will question continued funding or U.S. involvement in any international institution that impedes U.S. sovereignty.
So just so I understand,
we have to look at this through the prism of U.S. interests. That's where I stand.
So just to put a button on it, is it in U.S. interest to cut funding to Israel? Over $3 billion of funding that the U.S. gives to Israel every year. I understand your ideological position that they can do what they want as a country, but that is complicated by any U.S. funding. So I'm unclear about your distinction between you and the rest of the Republican field. They all still want to continue to fund Israel.
The distinction is clear. That's why they're all attacking me. But put that to one side. My view is the U.S. should focus on actually addressing the real threat we face, that's communist China.
So cutting funding to Israel or no?
Well, we have to stand by commitments we've already made. We're committed through 2028. Well,
so you would continue to fund Israel at current levels until 2028?
I stand by every commitment that we've made. I mean, if the U.S. has made a commitment, we're going to stand by that commitment. And I've further said that we would only cut aid to Israel when Israel tells us that they're ready to have that aid cut, which I think is in the interests of both the U.S. and Israel
Why?
for the U.S. not to be dictating what Israel's foreign policy is. I think
Why is
Israel
it in-
absolutely
Why
has
is it
the
in
right to
America?
defend
Can you help us
itself.
understand why it's in America's interest to fund Israel to the tune of over $3 billion a year, especially since so many Americans are increasingly concerned about the humanitarian abuses that are befalling on the people of Palestine with U.S. tax dollars?
Well, I think the humanitarian abuses are in reverse. Look at what Hamas just did to Israel. But our reason for having Israel as a stable ally is, first of all, a lot of that aid has run through the United States, our industrial capacity, an intelligence sharing agreement that has been helpful to the United States between the U.S. and Israel, and a reliable partner in the Middle East, a region of the world where we don't have other reliable partners. But at the same time, I believe in this conflict. It's funny. Not very long ago, earlier this morning, I'm having arguments with neoconservatives on the other end of the spectrum that are hitting me from exactly the opposite angle. There's an interesting discussion that's complementary to that one. The reality is, I stand affirmatively for Israel's right to fully defend itself to the fullest and to make Israel first decisions. And the problem is we're muddying the waters with the $16 billion aid package that isn't a prior commitment that we've made, but that is making its way through Congress now that I think is a bad idea. So my view is that we actually do better when we're not engaged in the Middle East. I'm not saying it's a comfortable balance of power, but you have the Arab nations, you've got the Turks, you've got Israel, all of whom have deep interests in making sure that Iran does not expand its power in the region. That's not something the U.S. should actually make worse. And I think every time we've tried to involve ourselves, we've made ourselves in the situation in the Middle East worse off for it, when in fact we have a real concern to face off with. That's China, the rise of communist China, who we depend on for our modern way of life. That combined to our own homeland security here. We're vulnerable to border incursions, cyber attacks, super EMP, electromagnetic pulse attacks in this country, missile attacks in this country. Protect this homeland, declare independence from China, avoid World War III. That's my foreign policy focus. And I do not think U.S. engagement in another no-win war in the Middle East is going to do us any good. That's why I've been alone in the GOP, actually, in identifying and staking out that position. But it's interesting. I do disagree with the left and the left-wing criticism of Israel on humanitarian accounts, but I disagree with the neocons who are blindly calling for more bloodthirsty responses of military engagement without knowing what or why. I'm different from both in that camp, and that's true. That's exactly where my position is.
Last question, then I promise we'll let you go. At this stage of the GOP race, it's clear that former President Trump's still way ahead. You, DeSantis, Nikki Haley, also polling respectively. Do you think it's time for the other candidates to get out of the race?
I think it'd probably be productive if the other candidates left the race. I think it would be productive. They've had their chance to make their case. I don't think that they really have a chance. I think that there's two America First candidates in this race. That's Donald Trump and myself. I come from a different generation. I have fresh legs. We're reaching young voters at a pace that's unprecedented in the Republican Party. 40% of our donors are first-time ever donors to the GOP. So we're doing something that's different. I think the last debate was totally useless. The second debate was completely a disservice to the voters. 7 people shouting on stage at the same time is not useful. But I do think a real debate on the merits. I mean, I have a fundamentally different view, including on these questions of foreign policy, from each of Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. We deserve to have that debate. I stand for what I think is the vision of the future, America First. But we deserve to have that debate in our party, and I'm looking forward to continuing that between now and the Iowa caucuses, where I personally think we're going to deliver a surprise result. Many of the people supporting us are people who have never been to a caucus before, and they don't get polled. So I think that there's a January 15th surprise in store, but the path from here to there is going to be all about serving the voters with actual clear debate about where we stand and why we stand there. And I'm going to continue leading the way on that.
Vivek Ramaswamy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.